Hello, and welcome to Eran Kaplan on Seven Blessings. Eran Kaplan is the Rhoda and Richard Goldman Chair in Israel Studies at San Francisco State University. He received his BA from Tel Aviv University and his PhD in modern Jewish history from Brandeis University. Before coming to San Francisco, he has taught at Princeton, Cincinnati, and Toronto. He is the author of several books, including The Jewish Radical Right and also The Origins of Israel. One of his most recent publications is Projecting the Nation, History and Ideology on Israeli Screen. In addition, he has contributed articles to Haaretz and Tikkun magazine. And now it is our great pleasure to introduce Professor Eran Kaplan. Thank you.
Thank you, Riva. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for letting me speak on a very interesting, wonderful movie, Seven Blessings. Though I will not be talking specifically about this movie, but I will try to place it within the overall kind of history and development of Israeli cinema. One of the great challenges that those of us who deal with Israeli cinema, who teach Israeli cinema, who love Israeli cinema, have to do is to define what is Israeli cinema, what makes certain movies typically Israeli. Well, the obvious answer is they were produced in Israel, or that they are movies in Hebrew. But beyond that, are there certain things that make the movies, beyond just the language and country of origin, uniquely Israeli? And in fact, this is a problem that many people who deal with various cinemas from around the world contend with. How do we define the unique national cinema of different countries? Well, one of the places we have to start is saying, what is it not? And Israeli cinema is certainly not American cinema, or it is not Hollywood cinema. And this is really true for many other national cinemas, that they are not Hollywood cinema, because Hollywood in many ways is the template, and many other national cinemas in some ways work in relationship to the Hollywood or the American model. So when we think about American cinema, when we think about Hollywood cinema, what comes to mind? And there are really two things that come to mind. One is that American cinema, Hollywood cinema, from the very beginning, was meant as a money-making operation. Films were produced a lot of times by people who love cinema, who love the art, who wanted to produce films more than ever. But ultimately, when you come through the Hollywood system, the Hollywood machine, you are there to make a profit. The bottom line is what you strive for. You hope to make a great movie, but it has to have great returns at the box office. In Israel, that is not the case. The majority of Israeli films over the years, before the creation of the state, after the creation of the state, did not even reach the equilibrium of covering the costs of production. The overwhelming majority of the films that have been produced in Israel lose money. But they were never produced in order to make money, with a few exceptions, and I will address those exceptions later on. They were seen as part of a national industry, as part of a national project to produce movies for a variety of reasons. However, commercial success was never part of the equation, was never the driving force behind producing those films. So this is one major difference between Hollywood and many other film industries around the world. And in this case, Israel is not all that unique. The other main difference is that the majority of Hollywood films fall into genres. We tend to identify them based on what type of movie they are. They can be science fiction. They can be a heist movie. They can be a romantic comedy. We break them into easy to consume and to sell and advertise categories. And once a film falls into a genre, we realize that although it could be realistic in the way it looks, it is not a true depiction of reality. We take snippets of things that look realistic, but we put them into a 90, 120-minute frame that works according to a certain predetermined elements that fit within the genre. For example, let's take romantic comedies. About 7 minutes into the film, we'll be introduced to the two main characters. About 15 minutes into the film, they will meet, usually accidentally, fall in love. This will be followed by a photo montage of the lovers going to the park, going on a boat, riding on a bike, having an ice cream. Then, about 35 minutes into the film, other characters from their past usually are introduced. There is some drama, there is some tension, and usually by around 50 to 60-minute mark, there's a falling apart. They drift away, but then 20 minutes later, they realize that they made a big mistake. And then at the very end, we are usually at the airport or the train station where they are chasing one another and announce their love and commitment. And this is a formula that has been tried and tested and carried out in hundreds of Hollywood productions. So, of course, this is not a realistic depiction of life. This is reducing reality into a certain formula. Israeli films, by and large, are very different. Israeli films tend to be realistic dramas. They are grounded by the reality of the Israeli experience. They describe realistic slices of life that usually reflect dramatic developments that are true to the historical record of the Israeli experience. And this could be war. This could be just service in the military. It could be social ethnic tensions. It could be a variety of issues that stem from the uniquely Israeli experience and then are translated into a dramatic narrative over 90 to 120 minutes. And one of the things that stands true with regard to Israeli cinema, and a lot of times frustrates my students and many viewers of Israeli films, is that they lack a final resolution of the plot, of the narrative. Many of the Israeli films are open-ended. There's not a clear Hollywood ending at the end. There is no true resolution. Again, with some important exceptions that I will address later on. Here, I'd like to give you an example of an ending of an Israeli film. It's a classic Israeli film that was released in 1969. The movie is Siege, and it tells the story of an Israeli widow who lost her husband in the 1967 Six Days War. And it tells the story of her attempts to resume kind of a normal life, raising her son, returning to work, and meeting perhaps a new partner. And towards the end of the movie, she develops a relationship with a man, and there seems to be a sense of promise. But then this new lover of hers is called for reserve duty in the military. He goes off. We hear news bulletins of an incident in the area where he was supposed to serve. And then the movie ends thusly.
חדשות מפי חיים תדמון. 3 אנשי צה"ל נהרגו היום בצהריים בהיתקלות עם חוליית חבלנים כ-15 קילומטרים ממערב לירדן באזור מג'דל בני פדיל. בהתנגשות זו נהרגו 7 חבלנים.
That's how the movie ends. The actors remove the makeup, the crew takes off the set, and we hear an actual news bulletin on the radio about Israeli soldiers dying in combat. The difference between fantasy, movie, and reality in Israeli cinema is always blurred. Israeli cinema always tries to capture the essence of the Israeli experience. It is not a fantasy. It does not try to take us to faraway places, to other planets, to some kind of fantasy where life resolves itself in a happy ending. No, it is always grounded in reality. So here we can ask ourselves, why is that the case? Why aren't there happy endings in Israeli cinema? Why aren't there genre films? And here I think we have to look at the economics of Israeli cinema. So Hollywood, the average budget of a Hollywood production is over $50 million. The average budget nowadays of an Israeli movie is under $2 million. That is a major, major difference. So with a budget of less than $2 million, you cannot have special effects. You cannot have major battle scenes. You cannot have 25 different locations. You cannot have studios with sound sets and elaborate scenes. This is simply impossible. So the production has to be very lean, very thin. They have to rely on actual locations, as you just saw at the end of this film. Most Israeli films are shot in actual homes and apartments. They're always shot on location, in capturing something real. So this is one reason for the realism that is so true for Israeli cinema. But there's yet another reason, and here we have to talk about financing. As I told you, Hollywood films from the very beginning are financed by commercial studios for the purpose of making money. That's what they're there for. This is how movies are judged. Israeli cinema, very different history. In the early years, and when I say early years, that's going all the way back to the 1930s, even before the creation of the state, when the Jewish National Fund and the Zionist organization produced films in Palestine. And then after the creation of the state, the movies were completely financed by the political organizations that ruled the Jewish community, controlled the Jewish community in Palestine before 1948, and then by the Israeli government after 1948. And the reason for production of films in those years was very clear. It was for propaganda, telling the Israeli story, the Zionist story, and broadcasting it to the world, and for fundraising. But there was never the idea that those movies will sell hundreds of thousands of tickets and will cover the production costs. No, it was seen as a tool, as a vehicle to tell the national story. However, by the early 1960s, the Israeli government, which was dealing with very harsh economic conditions in Israel, realized that investing in movies was just too expensive and there could be no justification for the use of public funds. So they decided to change the approach to cinema and decided no longer to invest directly in cinema, rather to offer tax incentives for individual private producers. And this launched a period of about 15 years in which commercialism was the driving force of Israeli cinema. Then, by the late 1970s, with pressure from the newly created film schools in Israel and from the industry, who claimed that the commercialization of Israeli cinema led to the production of poor quality of films to do injustice to the industry and to Israeli culture, the Israeli film funds were created, and they became the new vehicle by which movies are produced. The government provides funds to those independent funds who then decide where to invest the money and which films to produce. And those funds are fairly independent, and they are run by professionals and public figures who are committed to the future and well-being of Israeli cinema. But here we have to understand, those funds are not concerned with commercial success. They receive their budget from the government regardless of whether the movies make a profit or they do not make a profit. What they ultimately are interested in is international success and exposure for Israeli cinema. And this means participating in prestigious film festivals around the world and potentially winning the big awards, Golden Globes, the Oscars, or other such awards. And here the members of those funds have to kind of consider what are the type of movies that might have success in telling the story of Israel. And they immediately realized that the world is not interested in the next Israeli romantic comedy or the next Israeli sci-fi movie or the next Israeli heist film. What the world expects to see is an Israeli film that will say something profound or unique about Israel. And those movies tend to be realistic dramas that tell the story of Israel. And as a result, the overwhelming majority of Israeli films, and on average, there are about 12 feature films produced in Israel annually, tend to be realistic dramas that are grounded in the big questions and topics that dominate the Israeli experience. And so, over the past 90 years plus, for the majority of the time, movies were expected to tell the Israeli story, whether by direct government intervention or indirect government financing. But as I said, there was a narrow window from the mid-1960s until the late 1970s, where commercial considerations did drive Israeli filmmaking to a large degree. And in those years, an authentic Israeli film genre was created. And I'm talking here about Burekas comedies. Burekas, of course, is the Middle Eastern pastry. And the Burekas comedies were comedies where the protagonists tended to be Ashkenazi Jews on the one hand, and Mizrahi, Middle Eastern, Oriental Jews on the other hand. And there was conflict between those characters. But since this was a comedy, those tensions tended to be resolved by the hand with a very happy ending, a very Hollywood-like ending. Those movies were very much a comedic take on Romeo and Juliet. You'd have an Ashkenazi family or an Ashkenazi group, then you'd have a Mizrahi family, Mizrahi group. There'll be tensions, but the younger generation fell in love, the parents resisted, but eventually the youngsters overcome the prejudice and the tensions, and the movie ends with a wedding or some kind of resolution of those tensions. Now, why were those movies so popular in Israel, and why was there a demand for these type of comedies? The reason is that those tensions, those social tensions, those ethnic tensions, were really at the core of Israeli life throughout much of the 1950s into the 1960s and early 1970s. One of the biggest social and economic challenges that Israel had to contend with after the creation in 1948 was the absorption of immigrants who came to Israel. Now, initially, immigrants came, Holocaust survivors, and Jews from other parts of Europe who survived the war and were looking for a refuge after the war. But by 1949, the majority of Jews from Europe who intended on coming to Israel came to Israel. And then a wave of Jewish immigration from Arab and Muslim countries ensued, and this became a major wave fueled by hostilities after the 1948 war, tensions in many Arab countries, and later on also the Israeli government encouraging some of the Jewish communities, especially in North Africa, to immigrate to Israel, mainly for demographic reasons and the attempt to bolster the Jewish population in Israel. But this led to tensions between the veteran Ashkenazi community and the new immigrants who came from Middle Eastern countries. And here we have to take into account the fact that when the Zionist movement emerged in the late 19th century, it was a predominantly Eastern European Jewish movement. And those who joined the Zionist movement, those who came to Palestine from the 1880s onwards, came from a relatively homogeneous community. Geographically, it was from what was Poland, Ukraine, the western edge of Russia, Romania, and Hungary, so a limited area of Jews who had a shared kind of tradition, history. They came from a Yiddish background. So this was a group of people that had a lot in common, and they were the driving force behind the creation of the Jewish community in Palestine, and then the institutions that became the state of Israel. Jews who resided in Middle Eastern countries had a very different history, very different traditions, and very different background. And when those Jews started arriving in large numbers after 1949, this led to some serious clashes between the now veteran Ashkenazi community and the new immigrants. And there was a lot of discrimination, prejudice, in some cases racism aimed at those new immigrants. So this was a major challenge, trying to create what Ben-Gurion and other leaders at the time hoped would be an Israeli melting pot, whereby Jews would put away their exilic diaspora traditions and create a new, modern, authentic Israeli identity. But of course, this process was not easy, and it needed time before a kind of a cohesive Israeli identity would emerge. And humor played a crucial role in this process, because humor allows us to take stereotypes, often very negative stereotypes, prejudice, and put it in a place that feels safe, that feels protected, where you can lob those stereotypes from side to side in the hope that this will generate a new identity that in many ways will overcome those divisions, those stereotypes, those differences. And this became a hallmark of Israeli humor, of Israeli theater, and by the mid-1960s of Israeli cinema. And the movie that launched all of this is one of the most successful Israeli movies of all times, the 1964 comedy Salach Shabati. And the movie tells the story of Salach and his family, who are coming to Israel from some kind of Middle Eastern country. We don't know which one. And it tells the story of their very difficult absorption in Israel. At this point, I'd like to show you the very opening of the movie Salach Shabati, and we see the type of humor that it used throughout the movie, humor that will become the template for many movies that will follow it.
תיירים או עולים?
חצי חצי.
נו, זה יהיה יום.
Where's your camera?
The bags. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 6. Mama, where's 6? Where are the bags? Hier, zie je, aber ich nicht gefunden. Wie ist es? Wie ist es? Hier. 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
שהחיינו וקימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה. מאזן!
As you can see, we have the Ashkenazi family speaking a combination of Yiddish and English. They're counting suitcases. And then we have the Shabbati family, dressed in Middle Eastern garb, look very different from the Ashkenazi counterparts. And Salah does not count suitcases. He counts children. He also lost one along the way to be found again on the luggage carousel. So here we have the basic stereotypes. The materialistic, modern Ashkenazi family, the more primitive but warm Mizrahi family, and those tensions and stereotypes play all throughout the movie, but at the end, there is resolution. And much of the resolution had to do with the fact that two of Salah's children end up marrying partners from a nearby kibbutz. Those partners are Ashkenazi, and here is the lesson. Yes, there are tensions, there are differences, there are stereotypes to overcome, but by the next generation, those tensions will be over because the Ashkenazi or Mizrahi identity will simply disappear and the melting pot will produce a new breed of Israelis. As I said, Salah Shabbati was a huge success. In 1964, it sold over 1 million tickets in Israel. This is astonishing for a country with a population of less than 3 million. Now we have to add here that there was no television in Israel at the time. So cinema was a huge source of entertainment. And we have many records of people going to see Salah Shabbati 5, 10, even 20 times. So it's not that 1 million different Israelis watched the film, but still the commercial success was incredible. And after Salah Shabbati, dozens of Burekas films were produced in Israel, a series of comedies that would pit Ashkenazi and Mizrahi characters, one against the other, tensions, but at the end, resolution. And we can think of Katz and Carasso, and of course, another huge success from the early 1970s, Casablan, with Yoram Gaon, not only a Borges comedy, but also a musical with some very successful songs in it. So this became the Israeli genre. However, as I said before, by the late 1970s, the government began to invest again in cinema, and those ethnic comedies all but disappeared from the Israeli screen, giving way to the realistic dramas that would continue until this very day to dominate Israeli cinema. However, this does not mean that the ethnic question has disappeared from Israeli cinema. No, it would return, but it would return in a different way, a way that remembers the legacy of the Burekas comedies, of the ethnic comedies, but with a new take on them, with a different perspective. And one of the biggest changes would emerge in the 1990s, where some Israeli films would address the question of ethnicity in Israel, of Mizrahi identity in Israel. But instead of creating tensions between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi characters, they would turn the focus entirely on the Mizrahi community, trying to tell the story of Mizrahi immigration, of Mizrahi absorption in Israel, of the travails and challenges from a Mizrahi perspective without involving Ashkenazi characters as a kind of big other through which to understand and ultimately accept the Mizrahi characters. But those movies nevertheless continued to have some kind of dialogue with the old tradition of the Burekas comedies, often a critical perspective on that tradition. The truly revolutionary film in this new development was produced in 1994. It's the movie Shchur. Shchur is a type of North African black magic that was practiced both by Muslims and Jews in North Africa. And Shchur tells the story of an Israeli woman who we first meet in the 1990s, but most of the movie includes flashbacks to her childhood in the 1970s in a very poor development town where many immigrants who came from North Africa ended up in the 1950s. And she grew up in the 1970s in one of those very poor development towns. And her dream was to leave behind that area and become a successful Israeli, which she has. She became a popular presenter on television. But through flashbacks and memories, she goes back to her childhood and begins to question her rejection of her heritage, which she as a child viewed as primitive, as contrary to what Israel should be. But now, looking back, she begins to embrace and accept her legacy and really understand her Mizrahi identity and be much more in peace with her background and her upbringing. A similar approach we can see in the movie Shuli's Fiance from 1997. And this is a comedy of errors that takes place again in an area in a town which is predominantly Mizrahi, and there are tensions there between various Mizrahi characters. And the plot and the development is very much in the tradition of the old Burekas comedy, including the resolution at the end, but this time it's among Mizrahi characters, and there's no need for an Ashkenazi big brother of sorts to be part of the tensions. We can jump forward, 2012, another very interesting Israeli film, God's Neighbors, movie that deals with questions of faith, religion, violence, and so on. And here again, the movie takes place in a neighborhood in Bat Yam that is populated mainly by Jews who came from Middle Eastern countries. And here I'm going to show you a scene where two of the characters, one of them is of Turkish descent, the other is of Moroccan descent, and they have an argument. Which community is better? And in the process, they're throwing stereotypes at one another.
היום זה לא יום פוטו, מביא היום, איזה קוביות, תן לי לנשום, דבר לי. טוב לנו, זה 6, זה 3, זה 6, אח, זה טוב לנו, יאללה, יאללה, שחק, שחק, אבי, שחק, יאללה נשמה. תן לו בראש כבר!
יאניק, באמא שלך, בחיים שלך לברכתי יותר, הרגת אותי.
חבר'ה, אל תריבו, גם אם היה יושב פה היום, אברהים תתלס ושקלדנסטור קוגלו, בכבודו ובעצמו, היה מקבל את הקוביות לגבה. יואו! בלי לראות אני יודע שאתה שש.
איכס, יעקב.
בלי לראות. תן לנו להכות אותו שוק על ירק.
איפה הצניעות, יעקב? איפה הצניעות? איזה גאווה.
בסדר.
לא, יש משפט בשבילך. משפיל גאים...
כבוד הרב, בבקשה.
עדי הארץ, מגביה שפלים עד מרום.
תקשיב בשיעורים.
חס ושלום. זה לא גאווה, זה עובדה. תן לי להכות אותו. דובל 6.
אתה הדבקת על הכל דאבלים? אני לא...
מה הימים הטובים, אבי? קלוט, 1, 2, 3, 4. יאללה, נגמר לנו, נגמר היום. יאללה, שחק.
עזוב, אחי, עזוב. מחר אני מסתכל עליך בשגרירות טורקיה, עזוב.
אתה לא חזק.
לכלך על הטורקים, לכלך. יא גנוב, רק שתדע לך שכל הכוכבים הגדולים טורקים, אתה יודע את זה? אתם יודעים את זה?
וואלה. מי? כן, לא ידענו. מי?
כן? מי? ברי סחרוף טורקי?
וואלה.
שלומי שבת טורקי?
נעלי השבת.
בכלל חבל על זה.
אפילו אקי אבני? ליאור אשכנזי? עזוב, חוץ מזה. זה, הבורקס הכי טעים שלנו?
נכון.
השווארמה שלנו, יא גנוב!
רגע, באמת?
אתה יכול להתעורר בבוקר בלי קפה טורקי?
צודק.
סיימת? אבי ביטר שלכם? והמשט מה? וארדואן מה? וואלה, אם היה מכה 11 זה היה הם. יאללה, תתקדם. 4-1, טוב לנו. אם כבר תתעורר, למה כל הסלבס האורגינל זה מרוקאים. כן? יאללה, תרשום, שיהיה לו לפני השינה להסתכל.
דבר.
כן, תן, אז יש לנו מירי בועדנה 1. יאללה, יעל אבוקסיס.
2.
משה איבגי.
3.
משה פרץ.
4. קובי פרץ.
5.
5, אחי, הנה, רשום פה מכתוב.
רגע.
נמשיך עד מחר.
רגע.
כן.
ומיקי בוגנים? 6. לא? שלכם. טלי פחימה? שלכם. וענונו, יא גנוב.
יש משחק. יש משחק, עזוב אותנו.
תן מהלכים.
6, אין מהלכים, הנה, הולכים הביתה.
עזוב, חדש.
נו, יאללה, תניע, שנגמור אותך, טיק טק.
תראה כמה הוא מקשקש.
נו, שחק כבר. 4-3, יאללה, יופי, 4-3. הנה, הדבר הכי טוב שהבאתם, מאוס טורקי. יאללה, תתקדם. תביאו לי את הבא בתור, בבקשה. להביא לי את הבא בתור. איזה שינה טובה.
תן נשיקה, יאללה, נגמר, נו.
כל הכבוד, יעקב.
So here is a real homage to the legacy of Buretas comedies, hurling insults, stereotypes, fighting for cultural supremacy, but this time not Ashkenazi against Mizrahi, but Turkish against Moroccan. And also they're playing backgammon. And one of the characters gets doubles all the time. And this is a clear reference to Salah Shabati, where backgammon games and Salah's ability to get double sixes constantly play a crucial role in that movie. But there's yet another theme that runs through this new wave of Mizrahi cinema, of films that look into the Mizrahi experience in Israel. And this theme is the fact that throughout those films, some kind of family trauma, some kind of abuse, some kind of loss is revealed throughout the movie, but also the character, by accepting, embracing their identity, their heritage, even if they have issues with it, also are able to overcome this trauma and come to peace with their family, with their heritage, and with themselves. And this really brings us to 7 blessings. When you watch the film, you will notice that the opening scene, the wedding scene, is a complete reference to the Burekas films. It plays on the fundamental difference between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim in the context of a wedding ceremony. For Israeli viewers at this point, they might expect this tension or this difference to become the driving force of the movie. But no, it only teases us, but it's never the driving force of the film. The film ultimately is a look inside into the dynamic of the Mizrahi family and the difficult legacies of ancient traditions and the clash with modernity and what it means to be part of a modern state. And the overall message is that ultimately you cannot run away, you cannot escape your past and your identity. You have to come to terms with it. And this is the only way to bring about resolution and a sense of stability and hopefully peace of mind. And in this regard, we can locate 7 Blessings as part of potentially a new genre of Israeli cinema. And this is kind of the Mizrahi cinema that comes from within and tries to place and map Mizrahi identity within the overall matrix of the Israeli experience and Israeli identity. I hope you enjoy 7 Blessings. Thank you very much.